Well, good afternoon from Key West. This is my presentation on Vatican II, and what I chose as my topic was church architecture since Vatican II. This is a lecture by Duncan G. Stroick to the Catholic University of America. I really did enjoy reading the article, and I am a hands-on person with my ministries at St. Matthew's, most of it dealing with liturgy, most of it dealing with the liturgical celebrations. So with that being said, I'm going to move forward. And throughout time, we have built monuments to things which we revere, honor, and set aside as sacred. The Egyptians built temples and pyramids, as all did ancient cultures, to revere their gods or God. And temples stand to this day, which sometimes confuse us, intrigue us, just like Stonehenge does. Whatever was done at Stonehenge remains a mystery, but it's still fun and engaging to consider all the possibilities, what went on there. There's a value in feeling like you're in the awesome presence of God by your surroundings. Dr. Daniela, I love the pictures of the Abbey that you shared with us this past week in our postings. Kudos for being an oblate of St. Benedict as well. And different worship spaces make you feel, I think, more in tune with the Holy Spirit than others, just like some people, like our Holy Fathers, motivate us to be more in tune with the message. By that I mean, most of us, I think, in modern day are more in tune to listening to Pope Francis than we were to Pope Benedict. More to John the 23rd than we were to Paul the 6th. It's not that Paul the 6th and Benedict were any less holy. They're holy and educated men. It's the inspiration. It's the tag that you get by being inspired by these people, the charisma of a place. In the history of the Church, many monuments to man's understanding of God and how we are to cherish and nourish that heaven-to-earth connection have been erected. Within the walls of these cathedrals, churches, monasteries, abbeys, and basilicas, we have sought to celebrate our divinity with the Holy Spirit. If you've ever been to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, you feel as if you're in the presence of the Almighty, just with the overwhelming marriage of architecture, art, history, and just the sense of knowing where you are. It's overwhelming, just like St. Patrick's in New York. The Abbey Basilica, which I'm oblated to, even after its renovation, I still feel that presence of God. My parish church, St. Peter in Charlotte, I still do the same. Indeed, it has been the mission of the early designers and engineers of these houses of worship to overpower the person as well as empower them, to let you know you are in the presence of God. One is to know that they are in the presence of the Almighty and to be humble to serve. Constant reminders in stained glass, icons, statuary, and gargoyles are meant not only to intimidate once uneducated masses into remaining faithful, but also inspire them into becoming more faithful servants of such an awe-inspiring God. A God that can evoke these messages and these images has truly great powers, and our faith in Him is displayed through the architecture and the stained glass and the statuary and the way we design our worship spaces. I think that sometimes Christian furnishings were there to remind us that even though saints were human, we need to be there. The icons and the statuary that we see are there as very real reminders that these people are human and we can attain sainthood if we imitate their example. My article focuses on pre- and post-Vatican II architecture in churches. As an active minister in liturgical celebrations, this just fascinated me, how we have modified our liturgical surroundings since Vatican II to develop, to celebrate the liturgy. My article is from Project Muse, as I said, and it's actually the Frederick R. McManus Memorial Lecture given by Duncan G. Stroick to the School of Canon Law of the Catholic University of America on October the 30th, 2014. In his lecture, Stroick proposes that before Vatican II churches were pretty much built in traditional styles from pretty expensive material like stones, hand-hewn. Think of Notre Dame in Paris. I think of St. Peter's Basilica. And they pretty much had the same layout. Um, it's ironic that they all developed this way because there's really no existing documents that tell the builders how to build these structures. The lecturer maintains that after Vatican II, there was a shift in the thinking of how a church should be laid out, and that they should be more in the Protestant style of the latter 18th century of being in theater style. Um, uh, and also there was less emphasis on artistic furnishings. Tabernacles were moved out of the main sanctuary, and the priest turned around and faced the congregation. So obviously changes would have to be made if these so-called directives from Vatican II were followed. But what Stroic finds interesting is that there was a lack of concern or direction about architecture, and it was only referred to on a few pages of the Codex Iuris Canonici. I'm sorry. He does cite two sources that give some insight, but they're both pre-Vatican II on how a church should be laid out. One was the 1927 work by Nicholas Bailey, Altars According to the Code of Canon Law, and then a 1955 J.B. O'Connell book, Church Architecture and Furnishings, The Church's Way. His assumption, Stroic's assumption, is that architectural planners have assumed that Vatican II was not only to change the liturgy, but the liturgical setting. The Sacrosanctum Concilium dictated that the priest was to face the congregation, so organs were sold, tabernacles were to be hidden away, and new churches built in this modern style. He says this on page 6 of this article. But the Sacrosanctum Concilium does not require any of these things. He read it, and it was more or less the desire of some people that wanted to see radical changes, not only in the way the liturgy was celebrated, but how in the environment in which it was celebrated. He describes how the progression of several events over the course of time led up to Vatican II that influenced these changes. Protestant churches in the second half of the 19th century began redesigning their facilities. They had more of a semicircular seating, they had stages, and on these stages they put the choir, they put the speaker, and they were stripped of what they would call, in Protestant keeping, religious idolatry. He goes on to explain that the modern architectural movement joined with the liturgical movement and set out to rid architecture of all of its medieval and Baroque accretions. He says this on page 7. Using liturgical law, they wanted to return the church to simple altars, rejecting the Renaissance and later developments, the huge spired altars and all these beautiful insets and altarpieces, frontispieces. This influence spread widely through Europe, and it finally hit the USA right around the pre-World War II. It resulted in the buildings that many now call Vatican II buildings, but they were actually designed and built before World War II. They were concrete and steel and very plain and boxy with abstract stained glass windows. And you'll see some of these in this article. He provides plenty of truth to substantiate and examples of this artwork and this building styles to show how these post-Vatican II, or these Vatican II supposedly structures were built. They were very plain with abstract dynamic ribbons of stained glass. My church, St. Matthew's in Charlotte, is very much one of these post quote-unquote Vatican II structures. The altar is right in the center. We have semicircular seating. The tabernacle is off the altar into a chapel, an adoration chapel off to the side. Stroic says that the church has produced very few documents on church architecture, and some of the great churches of the world have been built without the church telling the builders what to do, such as the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. He says this on page 12. He alludes to the 1977 document, Environment and Art in Catholic Worship, and it was the catalyst of many of the changes that we saw in churches in the 70s and 80s. It was never adopted by the U.S. Conference of Bishops, and it was never sent to the Vatican for approval. But it still came down in the 70s and 80s as almost liturgical law for how you furnish and how you refurbish a church according to Vatican II, or what they thought would be Vatican II. Liturgical settings and requirements. The question comes down to, what do we do with our worship space? Is it to be entirely liturgically driven? Does full and active conscious participation, he says this on page 23, mean that the nature and beauty of the place should foster devotion and express the holiness of the mysteries celebrated there. So you have the two sets here. Is it just to be a practical liturgy, or does it inspire? Does it draw you in? Does it give you a place to have contemplative prayer, to feel like you're in the presence of the Almighty? What happens to the holy card images and the beautiful artwork that calls us to be more contemplative and aware of God's presence? Back when I was doing research with Father Pascal at Belmont Abbey, he showed me two window shades that on the back of them, when you pulled them down, they had a picture of the Sacred Heart and the Blessed Mother. That people had these in their houses, and when there was no priest, they would invite people over to pray the rosary, and to feel like you were more in the presence of God, they would pull down these shades. These shades are over 150 years old, and they're still intact. But this is how people celebrated or prayed in the South when we didn't have any circuit-riding priests coming through. It's worth mentioning that Strolick mentions the unrenovating of churches that began in the 1990s. He mentions Mother Angelica and her Shrine of the Blessed Sacrament in Alabama, and how she's bringing back pre-Vatican II, and you see this happening now. Churches are starting to return to pre-Vatican II architecture and furnishings. They're bringing back in Stations of the Cross. They're moving the tabernacle. In fact, some bishops are saying put it right back in the middle of the altar, behind the altar. That's where it is. That's where God is. That's where Jesus resides. That's where the focus needs to be. This leads into the three trends that Strolick cites as being mainstream in the last 20 years. The modernist tradition that uses the more plain architecture for church chapels or for college chapels and church chapels. The second trend, as I mentioned, was the unrenovating of churches that was done in the 70s and 80s. I remember a well-meaning friend of mine, the late Keith Kennedy, said that when we renovated St. Peter in Charlotte, that once we cut all the gargoyles out of there, and actually what they did was cut away history, they cut away artwork, they cut away heritage, and these plain Stations of the Cross now that are just whitewashed were beautiful images with Gothic ornamentation, and you knew and you felt like you were in the presence of God when you prayed the Stations of the Cross. Now you can't really tell what's going on in the different dioramas. So that's where we go. This is the ongoing discussion that must be kept open today. What do we do with our worship space? Is it liturgically driven? How do we make it more inspirational? One of my friends, Father Paul Buchanan, says that he does not really feel like he's communing with God in our worship space, our main worship space at St. Matthew's. He feels like he has to go to the day chapel because it's more intimate. He feels more of a divine connection there because it is more enclosed, it is more intimate. You have a statuary there, even though it's not painted in detail, most of it's white, you still feel like with the votive candles and everything else that you are communing with God in a more intimate nature. Contemplative prayer is much more active there. Finally, the author challenges us to consider the church as more than a space for just functional liturgy, as I call it. It brings many possibilities for making the intended space not only practical for the celebration of the Eucharist, but also for private and intimate communion through prayers with the saints and the Almighty. I really did enjoy this article. I love architecture. It's church-driven. This was, again, Project Muse. It was published in the Jurist, and I just think it was a wonderful article. You can see I went through and just marked all kinds of stuff in it. Beautiful illustrations. Everything about Vatican II that you would think is defining how we should redefine the interiors of our churches is contested and proven to be sort of misconstrued in this document. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this assignment.